I mean, I gave a speech at the Now Sexuality conference in which I had the misfortune to use two words together that, I mean, I violated the greatest taboo of this culture, which was that I used the words limp and penis in conjunction with each other. And, you know, one hasn't lived until one has done that publicly. I am just beginning to understand this. I mean, woman hating took me to the point where I began to investigate the nature of the sex act as such. And there are other people I know who are investigating it. I think that almost all that we know about what sex is wrong. I think that patriarchy, and one could put it this way, patriarchy exists to force women to cooperate sexually in a way that's absolutely inauthentic to them, to their own being and behavior. If there's anything biological about female sexuality that's biologically determined, sex as we know it violates it completely. I also believe that the sexuality that men have learned, which they call their masculinity, is completely inauthentic. I think that the concentration on erection and genitalia is a perversion of erotic communication between people. I think that the sexuality of women is not located in penetration. I think that barely speaks to the sexuality of women. I think it's just one possibility. And I think that if most women knew more about themselves sexually, it would not even be their favorite or most frequent possibility that they would use. And to me, somehow the freedom of women is going to mean an entire revolution in the way that we think about and have erotic interactions with other people. And that, I mean, that's what I have to say about it. I think that, you know, that there's no evidence at all that women require penetration in order to be sexually satisfied. And that's very important, because so much of the arguments that men use is that, well, if you change in these ways, we will be expendable. You won't need us. And that's because their whole identity is located in that erect penis. That can't be very pleasant for them, but it's certainly not very pleasant for us. It doesn't have much to do with who we are or what we feel or what we need. And I think that they're right. I think that when women change and when women are free, they won't be so interested in that act. But in my view, that's very hopeful, because there are so many sexual possibilities, erotic possibilities that are so joyous and have so much to do with intimacy and communication and tenderness as opposed to aggression, that to me, that's something to rejoice in.
Mm-hmm. But how do we picture this? It doesn't seem to me that that intercourse obviates the things that you talk about as a part of the sex act. I mean, we're not we can imagine a sex act, and it happens all the time, which penetration is what it is, right?
Right.
Somebody penetrates and comes, and that's the end of it. But there's also a picture which is much fuller.
Yes.
Unfortunately referred to as foreplay, afterplay. I mean, there's like a whole... Now, some people object to the idea of calling it foreplay. I mean, that you have to describe it as having it that beginning and middle and end. But we know that this other possibility exists. And what in it is objectionable? I mean, I know the physiological evidence that intercourse is not so gratifying as it would seem to many women, that their most erotic possibilities or responsive possibilities lie in the clitoris, which isn't necessarily in many women contacted in intercourse, etc. So what is the question? Yes. The question is...
which goes first, the chicken or the egg? I don't know. I don't know. I just know that things should be different than they are. Well, you can put it another way. I mean, what kind of intimacy can there be between people when one of those people objectifies and diminishes the other in every other area of life? So the sex act has to reflect that. Sure. It has to manifest that, right? And one can imagine if one is a woman, that one would not be so diminished and objectified. And that's the beginning.
But that is so, no matter what the mechanics of sex is, I mean, seems to me that one of the kind of perversions of the women's movement that's occurring now is a much more full sense of sexuality, the joy of sex and so on, in which everything can happen. And in fact, penetration is a small part of all the different wonderful smorgasbord of possibilities. But it's still completely objectified sex, and it doesn't have to do with love necessarily. In fact, love is only one of the possibilities on the smorgasbord.
Yeah, but see, I don't think that has to do with the women's movement. I think that has to do with, that's the echo of that sexual revolution that we all had the good fortune to participate in during the 60s. I mean, that's just a continuation of that. I don't find that in the women's movement at all. I think women are really trying to figure out how can I touch and be touched in a way that doesn't violate me? And that's a different question.
You see, what I'm not clear about is if you're talking about a specific physical thing. It's true that that if the people are better friends, and have a fuller sex act or a fuller sexual communication, that's better, right? But I'm just not clear about why.
See, I think the reason for that, I think the reason that it's so hard for me to talk about it, and the reason that it's so hard to understand it if one is listening to it, has to do with the fact that no matter how hard we try, we still put the male at the center of that act. And he doesn't belong there. If a woman starts out with herself as the active agent, and it's terrible to use this language, but I don't mean active in that she gets on top or that she propositions or whatever, but just as a living, breathing, active person who's there and who doesn't want to be treated with all of the many forms of disrespect, which is called sex in this culture, that an entirely different kind of sexuality develops from that. I almost believe that it's impossible to have what we know of as conventional sex if there is that kind of respect between two people. I think that it requires an enormous amount of self-control on the part of a man to sustain that kind of erection. And I think that self-control isn't very conducive to intimacy.
I don't understand, to sustain the erection? I
Yeah.
don't understand.
I think men spend a lot of their lives in a very inauthentic kind of stress that has to do with what
Staying hard for a certain amount of time.
what a writer named John Stoltenberg called pronging and prowling. That can't be a very good way to live, but it's all that men know. I think what's called the sex act will change. I don't think it will stay the same as it is, and I don't think it will be the mechanics of the sex act. I can't imagine describing real lovemaking in that way. I don't think men are so interested in those changes, but I think women have to be, because our survival depends on that. And I think that those changes will occur. And I think, yes, they are physiological changes. They are different ways of physically being with other people. I think that that lesbian experience for women is very important in understanding what female sexuality is all about. And I'm not talking about the kind of laboratory lesbian experience that was so popular for a while. I'm talking about really living out the feelings that one has for another woman and really trying to understand with another woman what touch is about. And I'm also not talking about, that everybody should go out and start doing these kinds of things, because I don't believe that these changes will take place in the bedroom. I don't think that two people can come together, say a man and a woman, and say, we're going to change here now in the bedroom. The change begins somewhere else. It begins in that man's regard for that woman's life. And if the change hasn't begun in the street and in the kitchen and in the home and in the leftist meeting on the issues, then it hasn't begun, and it's not going to change in the bedroom. But it'll be reflected there.
What you quoted somebody as saying about male erection interests me. There seems that there would be a point in which playful or warm fondling or hugging and kissing somebody else, which can be friends, turns into sex. I mean, there's like a little line there, right? And I would have assumed that when it does that, that there are physiological responses. Now, I know that erection is demanded in men, and that puts a certain pressure, and that a physiological response is demanded in women, the erection of the nipples, the wetting of the, but that a great deal of sexual repression and other kinds of uptightness, and in fact the alienation between men and women, causes one not to be able to respond, but that in fact one would expect oneself under ideal circumstances to respond, that is for the male to have an erection and for the woman to respond physically at that point in which they make that decision. I mean, in which they, are going beyond hugging and kissing each other or whatever. And are you saying something else? Are you saying that those responses are
Yes, I'm
that
saying
that
that
line
those,
moves a whole
yeah,
long
I'm
way
saying
over?
that line isn't the only line. I'm saying that line doesn't describe what erotic meetings between people can be, especially between men and women. I'm also saying that when one talks about the ideal circumstances, I mean, I really believe that a lot of times the reasons that women don't respond aren't anything like what we say they are. They have to do with the fact that that woman has been badly treated. Why should she respond?
Mm-hmm. That's what I would agree to, right? And I would agree that a lot of men don't respond or, find it hard in various ways to respond because they're just not up to that competition or that role that they have, or they dislike the woman. There's that theory also. They really experience their dislike in that way. But
I think
that
they
if
tend
they
to
were feeling better, that in fact they would have those responses, and I'm not clear that you're saying the same thing.
No, I'm not. I'm not saying the same thing. I'm saying that that men have erections, and that there's that they have them sometimes when they're with women and sometimes when they're not with women. But I'm saying that the erection isn't. I mean, we have in this culture, we only know phallocentric sex. That's all that we know about. And I'm saying that that's barely an indication of what sex between people can be. And I'm saying that I think phallocentric sex is very destructive to women, as things are now. Very destructive.
Probably very destructive to men.
I'm sure it is.
But-
See, I'm sure, but I can't speak for them in that way.
But would you de-emphasize orgasm for men?
Well, see, this really gets into something that I don't,
Yeah, I know. It's just
No, but see, this began for me. I started thinking about this when I was doing the witchcraft chapter, and I was trying to figure out why all those women were killed, why they were killed. What in the world could cause that kind of rage where all those women would be burned alive? And there's something that I came upon that I can't entirely, speak of or analyze yet, although I hope I'll be able to. It's a kind of postcoital rage that's very generalized in men, that has to do with having an erection and losing it, whether it's after after orgasm or not. And it makes sense if one's whole identity is rooted to one's ability to be erect and the size of one's cock and all of that, then one is going to be very angry at the person who sees one in that weakened state, which is experienced as being not male, not powerful. And in my research, along with the androgyny myths that I dug up, I also dug up some records, which I just referred to in that chapter, about men who had orgasms that were not simultaneous with ejaculation. In other words, they had orgasms, but they did not ejaculate. There is a written record of such an experience among human men.
No, I know that's true.
Yeah, and I believe in that. I believe that that's possible. I have seen in my own life that men are capable of that they can have non-ejaculatory orgasms, multiple non-ejaculatory orgasms. I believe that people know very, very little about this, and that it has to do with personality and, structural personality changes in men. And I think that those changes are desirable and necessary, and that women will never be free unless those changes occur. I
Well,
understand.
unless they don't relate to men.
Well, no, because even then, men remain who they are, and they remain powerful in the way that they're powerful. There's a kind of limited personal freedom that one can have as a woman in not relating to
Well,
men.
that's the problem with your separatist kind of frame then, because if you do assume that women remain in that dependency position, then separatism isn't real separatism ever anyway.
Well, no, I don't think that it's fair to characterize the whole thing as separatism.
Okay.
I mean, I think that it's now impossible for many women to work with men because the struggle of staying alive is a struggle that's invisible to men. And I think the most useful thing that women can do is to work with other women. But, I mean, of course, it's a very complex situation because we're living in a patriarchy, and that means that men have power by birthright. And that's what we're talking about, that birthright that robs us of power from the day we are born. Right? And when we talk about changing that, we have to talk about changing the sexual constitution of men and women, because that power relates to ideas of masculine and feminine, power and powerlessness. And I don't think it's simple, and I don't think it's easy, and I don't think it's going to be immediate. But to me, it's what makes sense. And the Sex Act is very tied into that because it's phallocentric in the same way that the society is phallocentric. And it is that chicken and egg question.
Right.
I understood what was just said, but I was still having problems when you were talking about erotic possibilities that we can hardly imagine. But I guess maybe I'm so literal-minded that I have to imagine them to understand the critique that you're making of things.
Think about it this way, okay? We're sensate beings, and in every part of our body, we are sensate. But from the time that we're very young, we're told we're not supposed to touch our genitals. And then sometime later on, there's a switch where all of our feeling is supposed to be located in our genitals. All of it, right? And not just feeling, but for men, and I think it's different for men and women, for men, the whole sense of identity is supposed to be located in the cock, which is supposed to be big enough and strong enough and erect enough and aggressive enough. I mean, it's that, somebody told me last night that Mae West had this line that went, "Is that a gun in your pocket, or are you happy to see me?"
Right.
Right?
That's a great old
That's what
line.
I'm talking about, in a way, right? I mean, is that a gun in your pocket, or are you happy to see me? Well, if I can think it's a gun in your pocket, you're not happy to see me. And that's got to change. But how can we change it? Because from the time that we're born, this taboo place that we're not supposed to touch is later supposed to become the whole focus of our lives. So that's the kind of damage that we're trying to work our way out of. And we tried everything we knew. I mean, those of us who lived through the 60s, we tried it every way that those men suggested to us that we try it. And for us, for most of us, it was terrible because we lost ourselves. We never knew who we were, and then we lost whatever it was that we knew. And now we have to do it another way that has to do with finding ourselves as women and our own sexuality, which is very, very different, culturally speaking, not biologically necessarily, but culturally speaking, from the sexuality of men. And in doing that, men too are going to have to change. Is that clear?
Yeah, and I think I'm going to have to... I think maybe I'm struck dumb at some level. I feel that I have to review my experience. I know that there's a tradition in poetry and whatnot that ejaculation is referred to as death. That there are some puns, in fact, in Shakespeare and other places for the experience of ejaculation as death. And what you said, that many men feel angry, and so I guess I'm lost because I'm reviewing all my experience to see if that's indeed what has been going on.
See, there's something else that's very important. I know we have to end, but it's very important, which is that all that we have are the male descriptions of the human condition and human identity. And it's called human, but it's not. It's male. So that the thing I remember that I grew up hearing about, how sad one is after intercourse and its death, it's not that way for a woman. Sherfy's work has shown us that our relationship to orgasm is quite different, at least as it's understood now. Okay? So we can't go along participating in that model that really doesn't describe what's happened to us at all.
But I think what Nanette's saying is that she's not sure it describes the men she's been with either. Right?
Although I'm aware of the tradition, and I mean, what you're saying is very heavy. Though we do have to end, so I'd like to thank Carol Lopate for having been here, and Andrea Dworkin, and I'll mention again the book that we've been talking about often, if not the whole time, is called Woman Hating. It was published by Dutton Press in 1974, and is a very good book. And thank you both for being here.
Thank you.